Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Benuli. Today we have Doomberg and Ira Harris. Doomberg operates a Substack and a subscription newsletter. It's number 2 Substack in the world. It was started in May of 2021 and designed to highlight the fundamentals missing from many economic and policy decisions. It quickly has grown to be one of the most widely read finance newsletters on Substack. Ira is an independent trader, hedge fund manager, and global macro consultant, trading foreign currencies, equities, bonds, and commodities for over 40 years. He was also CME director from 1997 to 2003, and also a stint there most recently. Welcome, Doomberg and Ira.
Yes, thanks. Great to be here. Small correction, we're the number 2 finance Substack in the world. If we were number 2 on the whole platform, that would be wonderful. But other than that, I appreciate the kind words.
Yep.
Well, maybe the exposure on Financial Repression Authority, push number 1. So
that's the hope.
Thanks, Richard. You do a great job. So hopefully we'll get a lot of traction with this one.
Great. Thought we'd begin with a discussion on your global macro view of the economy and the financial markets, Doomberg.
Yeah, I think, our specialty is in the energy sector, and our belief is that the resolution of the European energy crisis as we hurl towards winter of 2022-2023 is probably the most important geopolitical macro event ahead of us in the coming weeks and months. And a lot of this, of course, is made more important by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that resolves. And so the interconnected nature of the energy crisis in Europe, commodity prices globally, and geopolitics, war, all of this stuff is sort of feeding inflation/recession fears. And so we view the world through the lens of energy, and resolving what's going on in Europe ahead of this winter is the one big event that's on our screens today.
Interesting. And your thoughts, Ira?
Well, I'm interested in this because I just reread a book that I'd read in 2008, Petrostate by Marshall Goldman, who I view as probably the best Russian historian. Now he's passed away. But and it's an interesting book, Petrostate, because it really lays out everything that Doomberg talks about. It was there. And I'd read it in 2008 when it came out, because my respect for Professor Goldman was so great. But it is amazing how it lays out, including dealing with one of the things I've written about for years and nobody really wanted to talk about it, but the role of Gerhard Schroeder in all this. And in Petrostate, Marshall Goldman's such a great job of really talking about Schroeder. And that was, of course, back then. So I'm sure we're going to go a lot of places, but yeah, I'm looking forward for this. But I have really nothing to add until we see what really takes place coming out of Europe. I saw that the Spanish say that they can get that pipeline from North Africa through Spain into France and then Germany within a few months. I'm highly skeptical, but I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Yeah, if you could elaborate on your thoughts, Doomberg, for the energy situation in Europe, what the geopolitical risks are, and the effects on especially the economy and the manufacturing in Germany in particular.
Yes, to build off of what Ira just said, of course, Schroeder is the former chancellor of Germany and is considered a key architect of moving Germany off of nuclear power and towards Russian natural gas as its main energy input. Gas and oil, but natural gas in particular is in the news today. In fact, I believe he sat on at least one board of a major Russian energy producer, Gazprom, and And so he's a pretty controversial figure in Germany today. But the entirety of German manufacturing has been oriented around a confidence that access to cheap energy from Russia would always be there. And it's not. The sanctions that have evolved out of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and we have argued and written extensively that we believe had Putin not been handed the future of European energy, he would not have been so emboldened as to make the move that he did. And so these crises are feeding off each other, but the sort of original sin was diversifying towards, or concentrating, I should say, the opposite of diversifying, concentrating their energy procurement from Vladimir Putin, which then gave him geopolitical power. And, you know, the fundamental nature of energy, per the book that Ira referenced, really becomes apparent during times of energy shortages. You know, during times of energy abundance, it's just another commodity. But when it's in short supply, you realize what the true currency is, and it's joules, not dollars. And so to your question, concurrent with this natural gas situation, Europe is also in the middle of an extensive drought. And so you're seeing something very interesting going on right now in the markets, which is Germany is actually on track to store a sufficient amount of natural gas relative to historical averages. And yet year ahead baseload power in Germany is well over 400 euros per megawatt hour, which is tenfold increase over 2 years ago and catastrophic for German manufacturing. Well, what's going on? Well, the drought in Germany, which is, as it happens, you know, when something can go wrong, they all do at the same time. There's a massive drought in Germany. The water levels in the Rhine are dropping to crisis levels, which is making it very difficult to ship coal to the interior of Germany where the coal power plants are. And so even though natural gas storage is pretty full, the price of natural gas remains high, and the price of electricity has exploded, which we interpret to mean that the supply of coal might also be in doubt, or at least the ability to get it from where it is imported to where it needs to be burned. And then, of course, the market, it might be pricing in that Germany will be foolish enough to shut down its 3 remaining nuclear power plants at year end. And so you have this remarkable situation where a manufacturing superpower like Germany, literally overnight, has gone from a massive exporter of goods to a country with a trade deficit, if you can believe it, first time in 40 years. And so it just shows you the power of energy when shortages emerge, how critical it is to get your energy policy right, and the devastating consequences of screwing it up.
And your thoughts, Ira?
Well, yeah. So that's has been going on and will be going on. And then you know, I look at it from the global macro perspective, you know, coupling that problem in Germany, and it is a real problem. And we're asking, you know, it's interesting that we sit here in the United States and the US policymakers will ask German policymakers to make some very difficult decisions that I don't think we'd be capable of making in the United States, right? We have an election coming up. Do you think you'd be asking people to cut their energy usage by 20%, turn down your air conditioning, businesses to cut back on the use of natural gas? And what I think that they'd look at you and go, "Are you out of your mind?" You know, it's nice, but I have to appeal to my constituents, my voters, and not what you may deem to be the most important issue. And I think when you look at that, this is truly what Putin understands as much as anybody else, right? And that he can drive wedges in many places. And you couple it with that, and for Germany, as you know, I've talked about before, Richard, you know, the Germans compete not with the United States, but when it comes to advanced engineered products and re-engineered products, with the Japanese. And the Japanese yen relative to the euro as weak as the euro has been, the yen has been that much weaker. And that's a relationship that is very, very important for Germany, especially from autos to machinery, from machine tools to high advanced technological goods. So they are getting really squeezed, and this is a very dangerous time. And the tougher times get, the more Putin tends to squeeze, right? With the whole thing with the
Nord Stream 1 pipeline, yeah.
Right, from Canada, and they waived the sanctions. So as I say, Putin's sanctions are a lot better than the U.S. sanctions, and that's where we fall. But there are a lot of issues in play.
Yeah, I would say to that point, we've argued, and look, you trade currencies for a living, Ira, so feel free to correct me, but the DXY is 83% composed of the euro, the British pound, and the Japanese yen. All three of those entities, countries or union areas, are deeply short energy, and that's why we believe during times of energy crises, your relative position vis-a-vis energy explains a lot of the variance of your currency moves. And so it doesn't surprise us that the yen and the euro and the British pound have weakened substantially. And it doesn't surprise us that the ruble bounced back in the way that it did, because ultimately, during times of energy shortages, the real currency is energy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You guys cover that so well. Really, very, very in depth. And we did a podcast with Richard, hosted it with Zoltan Pozar. After he wrote the piece about the petrodollar. But that's an old argument and a discussion that when I was in graduate school studying a lot of this, that was already an issue in the mid 70s as to where that was going to go. But here we are, and you've really highlighted it very well. So yeah, thanks for bringing that.
Thank you.
And in terms of the shortages you mentioned on energy, is it systemic, or is it more from the sanctions and also the subset of the ESG crowd that is trying to move everything to renewable essentially overnight? What are your thoughts on that, Doomberg?
Yeah, so I would say, and this might sound a little controversial to those who haven't given it much thought, but the sanctions have largely failed, and we believe that is a good thing, because if they had succeeded, energy prices would be far higher than they are. So the reason why we have elevated energy prices today, we believe, is mostly because the industry stopped investing new capital, and part of that is because of the defund the fossil fuel movement, for sure. But also part of it is because the shale revolution destroyed a lot of capital. And when COVID hit, you had not only sort of damage to infrastructure, but you had damage to balance sheets. And you saw, wave after wave of E&P companies going bankrupt in the year 2020. And the companies that emerged from bankruptcy and recapitalized have a newfound discipline. And we've got decades of experience in the commodity sector on our team, and this is a point we've made over and over again. And it should ring true to people who have such experience, but if you don't, it sounds counterintuitive. You cannot fight a volume war with sanctions. You can only fight a price war. Here's the proof. So if we were successful in removing 50% of Putin's oil from the market, 5 million barrels a day from the export market, let's just say, the price of oil would way more than double, and Putin would still end up with more revenue. If the objective of the sanctions was to reduce Putin's revenue, which we fully support, the proper way to have done that would be to flood the world with energy and destroy the price. Oil went from minus 37 to plus 137 in the span of 2 years because it is a highly inelastic material. In the commodity sector, you make all of your money over a cycle in the very brief period where there's a true chronic shortage. Trying to constipate Russia's oil production and sale from the market is a failing strategy. It was bound to fail. We're glad it failed, because otherwise the price of oil would be $250 or $300 a barrel. And if you doubt it, just consider the following fact set. When the LNG, liquefied natural gas export facility in Freeport, Texas blew up, it took about 2% of the US's total natural gas production, that much worth of exports offline. It happens to be about 20% of US exports because to the nearest, decile, we export about 10%. More like 12 or 13% now, but just using round numbers. So just the reduction of 20% of US exports of LNG caused the price of European natural gas to double. Imagine what would happen if we took 5 million barrels a day of oil off the market to quote unquote punish Putin. We would see $15 gasoline in the US, and the people who would be punished are the politicians who put us in that spot. So this is very counterintuitive. The sanctions, having failed, explains the recent pullback in energy prices and removal of the risk premium. The reason why oil spiked to 137 in the first place was because people feared that the sanctions would work. So I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if you spent any time in commodities and you understand how price elasticity of demand works, you cannot win a volume war. You can only win a price war.
Yes, great points. And your thoughts, Ira?
Well, no, and then you get, the G20 meets and they're upset with India and China, right? Because Putin is discounting the oil. Well, what would you expect to happen? And if you were really in that ESG group, you should probably be applauding that they're buying the discounted energy sources rather than burning more coal, which they're going to do anyway. Because at the end of the day, globalization is a wonderful thing, but as globalization breaks down by what a lot of people are out there writing about, and I'm not going to disagree with it, but as globalization breaks down, you can take all these agreements from Glasgow to Paris to Kyoto, whatever agreements you want, they become nebulous at best because, well, if I'm not going to partake in the benefits of it, I'm going to do what's best for my citizenry, and I'm going to operate with the cheapest energy level, with the cheapest energy source that I can. So everything that you're working for truly breaks down because as you meaning the United States and Western Europe, use less of the traditional fossil type fuels, and you've moved away from nuclear at the same time, everything in that world that's an alternative goes up in price for everybody else. So they're going to gravitate to the cheapest, and you're going to lose total control of that narrative. So I just, when I watched all of this taking place, and my mailbox again was filled with, people who watch 60 Minutes and watch Dalib Singh, and I go, and they're going, wow, isn't this great? I said, it reminded me of Robert McNamara in the arrogance that was promoted. And if there's one of my favorite demons ever is Robert McNamara, because I'm of that age and spent a lot of time at anti-war demonstrations about the arrogance of Robert McNamara. And I thought that America's approach, the U.S. approach to that, was very much in that vein. So didn't get us much, by the way.
Well, you have to wonder who's being sanctioned at some point, right? And what you're describing really, and the fear that we have in Germany is if governments don't respond to the needs of their populace, like in the way that India has, for example, as Ira described, what you end up with is sort of sharp rightward turns with violent revolutions and overthrow. We have said repeatedly that on the path from abundance to starvation is riot. People aren't just going to quietly starve. They will riot first. And we're seeing that in the most vulnerable countries. As Germany soaks up the world's incremental supply of coal to make, to ensure that they have enough to get through the winter, somebody else who was going to buy that coal is going to be short. Like there's energy is, finite. And so the price of coal has exploded. All these things are interconnected, of course, during times of shortages. And so, we're recording this on Friday, and the price of, generic first coal, Newcastle is $400 a ton. 2 years ago, you could get that for, $50 a ton. You can't increase the price of critical raw materials by a factor of 8 and expect that everyone's going to make it. And so the resolution of the European energy crisis is the single most important geopolitical event because, again, the same way that it cascaded out, a favorable revolution could sort of dampen all of those negative side effects. So, for example, we've warned our clients and written that if a peace deal suddenly emerged over the weekend, oil is going to trade at $60. And so you always have to be careful. You're one headline away from the inelasticity features of life necessary commodities working the other way against you. That's how we ended up with minus $37 a barrel in 2020. And so I remember the 60 Minutes interview that you referenced, and I was aghast because it's very immediately apparent that nobody in the administration had thought through the consequences of what they were doing under the assumption that they would be successful. We immediately assumed that it's hard to tell, but we imagined that it couldn't be successful because the consequences of it being successful were so dire to so many people. Again, if we cut 5 million barrels a day of oil off the market, the price of oil goes $300, $400, $1,000 a barrel. Pick your number. There's a clearing price. Most people won't be able to afford to pay it. That's the nature of inelastic demand. During the Texas freeze, natural gas was trading for the equivalent of $6,000 a barrel oil in some regions in the U.S. because literally people had to have it and would pay any price. And so these types of blow off tops in commodities do extreme economic damage. And energy is look, you could cut them off of computer chips and the world would be fine. But you can't cut them off of energy. You can't cut the world off of energy. All of these economies that are, quote, value add are basically inverted pyramids. And if you remove the base of the pyramid, primary energy, they collapse. And so this is timeless lessons that you referenced, a book that you had read a long time ago. These are well-known lessons, but every once in a while, people forget them and reality tends to remind them.
Yep. Yeah, and we come back to the 70s, right? Because I always remember, with the recycling of what we called the petrodollars back then, of course, which led to the huge amount of debt for the emerging market world. And I know, I believe you wrote, you guys covered Sri Lanka pretty well and what went on there, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure that was.
Yep, we did.
Yeah, it's some really good work. So you see energy and food come absolutely on a collision course, which really was, everybody's talking about 70s with this, that, and the other, but if you really want to look at it, it was the damage that was done to the emerging, well, back then, of course, we called it the less developed countries or third world. But the outcomes are really very dangerous, especially when you look at what they have to do to cover their dollar-based debt load that, of course, has been foisted upon them by central bank policies, especially the Federal Reserve. So everybody's borrowed up in dollars, and they're forced in a situation they can't let their currencies weaken because then their debt bills become ever higher. So like Mexico raised 75 basis points yesterday. They're up at 8.5% on overnight funds. And it's to secure that the peso doesn't really weaken here because they have a lot of dollar, no matter how much domestic debt they can issue, they still have a lot of dollar-based debt. And for a lot of other countries in the world, it's even worse. And when the decision becomes, well, do I import oil? Do I import energy or do I import food? Because they need both. And I think the U.S., and I've talked about this probably ad nauseum for some people, but the United States has made a severe mistake by not securing grain supplies to ensure that the emerging market world had food. Because an emerging market, as Doomberg talks about, hungry people are not a way to run a country.
Yeah, we wrote this piece called Running from Empty, which we published on July 14th, which covered the Sri Lanka story. And to emphasize what Ira just said, food is actually just a critically important solid form of energy. And the thing that really strikes us from the Sri Lanka story is it literally only took one growing season for the country to collapse. And it's pretty remarkable. There's some unique peculiarities about, the government decisions and corruption and all the other stuff, but those are always, in hindsight, evident. But it literally just took a year for we started the piece by saying, but up until 2020, Sri Lanka was a pretty good country. It has a GDP per capita of twice that of Ukraine, for example, and 35% higher than India. And so has a nice, great history, great culture, and it collapsed because they screwed up their energy policy. Like, this is important stuff. And if you get it wrong, you have catastrophic consequences. The U.S. is, the president was panicked at the prospect of $6 a gallon gasoline. That's a huge inconvenience and an economic struggle for many people in the country. But the U.S. was never in danger of running out of food. For many in the world, sort of those nearer to the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the exportation of such inflation to ensure that we have enough and that the Germans have enough coal is devastating. And it's really sad to watch unfold and utterly predictable, because we've been writing about this since the beginning of Doomberg last year. And so, we wrote about European natural gas last fall, long before there was a crisis and before there was a war. We wrote a controversial piece called Putin's Fools Rush In. And the main point of that piece, which we wrote, I believe, in October of 2021, was we're handing Putin all of our cards. Now, we thought he would play them to get Nord Stream 2 approved. Instead, he played them to secure his geopolitical ambitions in Ukraine. But either way, he wouldn't have been able to do either if we hadn't so foolishly followed Schroeder over the abyss. And we did. And so now, we're playing this new game that we're forced to play, and playing it rather poorly.
Do you see things getting worse on the food front from like recent trends by, for example, in the Netherlands and in Canada, effects on farmers from government policies relating to carbon and nitrogen emissions and usage?
Well, it sure seems like a poor time to be focused on that.
Yeah.
And Michael Schellenberger just put out a great piece this morning on it. He writes on Substack, and which is rather unfortunate because we were researching one and he ultimately kind of scooped us. And so it's going to force us to write a different piece. But, it sure does seem like a very poor time to be disrupting the manner in which the Western countries produce and procure their food. There are certainly environmental issues in the agricultural space that, with smart and innovative technologies and careful government coaxing, we could substantially reduce the negative impact on the planet that undoubtedly flows from the production of food. You have to weigh the costs and timing of those moves with the real need to feed people today. And so at a minimum, it's tempting to sort of be seduced by the conspiracy theories, and they'll probably turn out to be true. But it's not the kind of world we'd like to live in, where people are doing these kinds of things on purpose, knowing that it will result in starvation. Although the piece we'll put out this morning on nuclear power, called Malthusian Malarkey, makes that very point, that the people who have opposed nuclear power do so from a Malthusian school of thought, which is quite cruel. And so it is, at a minimum, very questionable timing.
Interesting. Your thoughts, Ira?
I'm just laughing. I'm going to have to go down to my bookshelf and dust off my copy of The Limits to Growth from the Club of Rome. It's just, and the policies are with food. I don't know whether you guys covered that or not. Like when Samantha Power, who really I'm not a fan of, have never been a fan of it. Whatever elicits from her pen or her mouth has been so wrong for so many years. But she came out, when was it? Even before the real problems in Sri Lanka. And she talked about, well, if there's a shortage of fertilizer, we'll just use natural fertilizer, meaning, I guess, horse manure or anything else that goes with it, and we'll be able to deal with this. And these people are totally clueless. I mean, you can't, it's just not going to happen. And the ability, there's a reason that we use certain types of fertilizer, because since the beginning of the Green Revolution, not the one that we're talking about now, but back in the 70s, the Green Revolution that really produced dynamic impact as quick as I think anything that we've ever seen. Because once we introduced different rice growing techniques and different wheat grow, that the world's ability to produce the amount of food to support a global middle class, because it's China is China, and China can never be without food. It's just not going to happen anymore. They're too far along, and their food habits have changed so dramatically. So you're not going to support them on a minimus calorie intake. And I always love Doomberg's work on energy, and food is energy. And if you doubt that, go read Václav Smil, who has done probably as great a work to bring us on the history of civilization and energy, and to understand that, right? Yeah. When my ancestors had to pull a plow in the fields, you had to make sure that they got enough energy to eat. And that's why it was subsistence, because basically what they grew, they ate in order to keep the cycle going. I mean, thank God we're so far beyond that due to such great technological advances. But, I think everything Doomberg talks about in this regard is so important. And, I want to hear him expound a little bit more on the use of nuclear power, because I think there's been some devastating mistakes made as we've tried to hit that the magic bullet and able to transition from fossil to, I'm not sure how long it's going to take, far longer than most people want to believe, and these silly targets that they set for themselves. But I want to hear more about that, because I think that's so important to where we're at right now.
Your thoughts on nuclear fission,
yeah,
and the potential also for fusion?
Yeah, so I would say we have a solution to radically reduce carbon emissions globally if we decide that that's what we want to do, in a way that minimizes negative externalities. And that requires no technical invention whatsoever, and requires relatively modest financial investment compared to the alternatives on offer. And that is nuclear power. We don't even need fusion. In the piece we wrote this morning, Malthusi and Malarkey, we covered how Ontario, the province of Ontario, which is everybody would characterize as a fully developed, sort of use the old language, first world province with healthy manufacturing and high standards of living and a well-educated population and durable institutions. Between roughly 2004 to 2014, they essentially decarbonized their electricity grid. They completely outlawed the burning of coal, and that has been successful. Less than 10%, probably roughly 8% of the electricity produced in Ontario today comes from the burning of natural gas or oil. 90+% of it comes from nuclear power, predominantly, hydro, and wind. And nuclear power in particular accounts for 90% of the coal that was removed from their grid. At the start of this project, Ontario was suffering from major air pollution problems. Toronto had, something like 50 or 60 days worth of, poor air quality readings in a calendar year. And so they decided to get rid of coal, and 90% of the coal was replaced with nuclear. Literally just refurbishing and restarting 6 nuclear reactors made Ontario a case study in how to decarbonize their economy rather quickly and rather efficiently. And they have, cheap and plentiful energy. Now they're undoing some of that. And they had a disastrous rollout of a copycat strategy of what Germany has done. Luckily, the voters in Ontario throughout the governing Liberal Party in a near complete wipeout in the 2018 election because of that boondoggle, massive grift and massive waste of taxpayer money in an attempt to replace nuclear power with intermittent renewables. The path exists. It requires no technical innovation. And we say in the piece today, if you think nuclear waste is a real problem, you're either a victim of propaganda or a knowing architect of it, because it's not. It's totally irrelevant. It's solved. It requires no inventions. The energy payback period, which is different than the financial payback period, the energy payback period for nuclear power is 6 weeks. So however much energy it takes to build and start a nuclear power plant, you get all that energy back in the first 6 weeks. And then for the decades that remain, 50 to 100 years, you get surplus energy that you can then use to distribute across your population and increase people's standard of living. Your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to use. Everybody everywhere wants a higher standard of living. The highest density fuel is uranium. One thumbnail full of uranium is the equivalent of a ton of coal. And no society has progressed by scaling back in energy density, going from high energy density sources of fuel to low energy density sources of fuel. It's proven, the data is irrefutable. Everywhere it's been tried, it's failed. Everywhere nuclear has proliferated, it's succeeded. And yet, our society just refuses to believe the data. And worse than that, calls out the people who are making that case and calls them sort of backwards looking planet haters. It's the reverse. It's forward looking people lovers, humanists who believe that we can provide a high standard of living for everybody on the planet. And there is a path to do it that requires no invention. It just requires political will, which unfortunately has been hijacked by people who probably don't have that intent. So this is obviously a topic we're very passionate about. And so I'm sorry if that answer was too long, but that's our views. And that's why we are able to write these pieces so passionately, because we believe them in our core.
Yeah, that was awesome. Very interesting facts. Your thoughts, Ira?
Well, I'm just going to, I sit here next to me with the piece that came out February 23rd from Gehring and Rosenzweig, who explained exactly what Doomberg just talked about with the energy return on energy invested. And I always highlight it because it said nuclear power plants have the highest EROEI of energy source. It's 100 to 1. And versus others that are so ridiculously low. Now, that doesn't mean that you might not be able to get there, but for the transition period, and so many people who have been married to this, look, I have children and grandchildren. I want a safe as world as possible, but you are not going to just wave a wand, unfortunately, and make the transition. No matter how many Greta Thunbergs you put out, it's not going to happen, and you're not going to wish it away. Being that I was, that I came out of international relations, foreign policy, and of course, back in the 70s and 80s when Europe was busy with the anti-nuclear campaign, which really begot the green movement in Europe. And people say, well, we'll just get rid of nuclear weapons. I said, yeah, who's first? Who's going first? Okay, you want to get rid of yours? Do you trust the other side to do exactly that? So, we all want the immediate effects of a better world, of a healthier world, for what we know about, so many things in science about a decarbonized world. Or of course, probably the most significant phrases will be as we go on, and as we see, I think out of this, out of the newest bill that came down, the Inflation Reduction Act, with all the spending on green energy, we're going to see a lot of discussions about carbon capture, carbon sequestration. I mean, really, people have been working on it for far longer than anybody imagines. The South Africans, the Germans, there was so much work going on it, 70, 80 years ago, 90, it's not new, and there is technology, but going forth, so is looking for, of course, where we're going to get to is investable ideas out of this, because I think everything Doomberg talks about is so point on. But it's interesting that France, France rarely does anything right, but the fact that, they were so busy subsidizing the French nuclear power industry with people's money, but even that, as far ahead as the French have never turned off their reactors, of course, but with the low water levels in Europe, they've had to cut back on, because they're a little afraid that they don't have the that you're going to wind up with a problem here. So
worse than that, they dropped the ball on the maintenance, which is also part of the problem as well. But you're completely right. Didn't mean to cut you off, but I don't want to give them too much compliments, because they managed to screw up a winning hand.
Well, but I always go back to what happened with Hinkley Point. The Brits were onto something. I think they played a stupid hand because when they were still before Brexit, even before breakfast, when Hinkley Point was being pushed, and the amount of power, and it was, and in an effort to keep the Chinese out, especially, right? And they could have funded this by selling the bonds right back to the ECB, at ridiculously low rates. I don't know what the maybe you know more. I've just never been able to follow exactly what the Brits have done here.
Yeah, it's not something I understand either, unfortunately.
And so, any thoughts on like investable ideas given this environment? I mean, like from the U.S., do you see a trend of U.S. companies exporting LNG, liquefied natural gas, and even wood, right, to Europe, especially? I mean,
Yeah.
to fuel the renewable energy happening there, right in Europe, using a lot of U.S. wood.
Yeah, so we're the last to give investment advice. I'll leave that to Ira or yourself, but I would say we're more interested in which companies are going to make a lot of money. We invest mostly privately, but it's easier to predict who will make money than which stocks will go up in our experience. But as a general rule, as we sit here today, the price of natural gas in Europe is $62 per million BTU, and the price of natural gas in the US is less than 9. Now, 9 is still very expensive in the US and still a potential political problem for Biden as we go into the winter and people's heating bills double and triple. But still, on the global basis, and to your question, any manufacturer based in the US who is heavily tied to natural gas as an input, but can export their product and price it on the global market, they're going to be printing cash on that spread. And that spread is very difficult to close. That arbitrage, it's really the mother of all arbitrage opportunities, but it will eventually close because all arbitrage opportunities eventually do. But this one is particularly persistent because of the difficult nature of transporting natural gas across oceans. And so if you are a fertilizer producer like CF Industries and you have a giant plant in the US and you're paying US domestic natural gas prices, but you get to sell your fertilizer on the open market at global prices, that spread, $62 for your competitor in Europe versus $9 that you're paying here, is essentially a printing press. And so any company that is based in the US today and is sourcing energy domestically and adding value to the product, and they could sell that product at global prices, this is, the next 2, 3, 4, 5 quarters are going to be generational profit-making opportunities.
Yes, interesting. And your thoughts, Ira?
I mean, that's one amongst many. And, we've seen this before in the US, by the way. Remember when West Coast energy prices went so high that Boeing and some of the huge aluminum fabricators, they were selling off their energy. They could make more money selling energy than they could the product because everybody was willing to pay for it. And because people really don't understand that Boeing in Washington, it wasn't a mistake. It was because hydropower was the cheapest form of power. And an aluminum fabrication takes a huge amount of energy. So you do see this. American companies aren't stupid. They'll go, and as Doomberg talks about, arbitrages, which is how I made my money initially and learned about the actual movement of foreign currencies, was through arbitrage. It is a very effective way in how markets really work. And if you allow it to work, it'll bring prices in line with each other. Right now, because of the, I would say, malfeasance of Gerhard Schroeder and Angela Merkel. But I was kind of surprised to read, so we see these things develop, that it was back in early 2001 or 2002 that Schroeder had already put forth the idea that in order to placate, I'm sure, green voters in Germany, that nuclear power, because of what they were doing with cheap energy from Russia, of course, would be they would be able to wean themselves off between 2011 and 2021. I was really shocked to do that, but again, it has provided all these arbitrage opportunities. So yes, you have to find the firms, but a lot of people don't realize there is no LNG spot market, because so much of LNG, although I'm sure it'll develop due to, of course, arbitrage, but LNG was originally, because of the infrastructure costs were so high, and especially in the United States, a lot of the Asian nations provided the funding capital for it. So those were met with long-term contracts. So when Biden et al. Came out and said, well, we're just going to, we'll be able to ship LNG, you will, but not to the extent that you think, because those are long-term contracts that come out of, the Sabine Path. And I don't know how many, I think there's 8 large LNG processors in the United States. I know that there'll be more, and I know that Germany's trying to build for the other end. So this is not a short term. And again, the Asian nations who finance a lot of the LNG processing, they want those. I'm sure they'll want those contracts adhered to. So not easy.
And just a final question, Doomberg, your thoughts on how you see things playing out on the energy situation globally with the geopolitical risk, like over the next year or two?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, of course, it all depends on the resolution of Ukraine, and the continuing taking out of the risk premium from the market. And if peace were to break out, like I mentioned earlier, I think, and which we should all hope for, we certainly hope for, that would be a major sort of resolution. The other thing to watch, though, is after Biden's, I have to say, disastrous visit to Saudi Arabia, where MBS didn't even bother to meet him at the airport. News broke out this week, still unconfirmed, that Xi from China might be heading to Saudi Arabia here soon, which is fascinating on multiple levels, especially with the Party Congress coming up and Xi's gambit to basically become dictator for life in China. I'd be very curious to see if he actually goes to China and the disparity in how he is greeted versus the manner in which Biden was treated when he went to Saudi Arabia. It's also interesting that Xi would risk leaving the country ahead of this Congress. So many view that as an indication that he feels quite confident in his position. But I'd keep a close eye on the sort of developing relationship between Saudi Arabia, Brazil, China, Russia, and India, and their efforts to fully wean themselves off of the US dollar and develop their own basket of a currency backed by a basket of commodities might be quite attractive to much of the world. And that would certainly mark a transition from an petrodollar era of the last 50 years to Lord knows what, but something completely different. And so Xi's upcoming visit to Saudi Arabia, if it happens, I think would be a critically important geopolitical event to keep a very close eye on.
Wow, great. And your final thoughts, Ira?
No, I just want to ask you a question, though. In 2017, and this never leaves my mind, when the Saudi king went to Moscow, I viewed it as such a major sea change in the world. For, if you want to really talk about a place that the Saudis, Russia, seriously, with everything that went on, but the Saudi king went, and to me, that changed the entire game forever.
Yeah, so Luke Roman would say this was because the U.S. failed in its obligation to make the U.S. dollar as good as gold for oil. And the long-term consequence of that failure is still playing out from the global financial crisis, where Bernanke was faced with a critical decision. Do I inflict pain domestically to keep the reputation of the U.S. dollar as always being as good as gold for oil? Or do I turn inward and make sure that we take care of our domestic needs? Turned inward, And the consequences of that decision are still playing out. If you believe Luke Broman's excellent work, and we're big fans of it, and so obviously we do as well. So, and again, the treatment of Biden by Saudi Arabia, and then the subsequent and very quick visit of Xi to the kingdom is another milestone to look for, to see whether we are in fact on the path that it appears that we're on, which is this, multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar world, and sort of half the world aligned with Russia, China, and by the way, like Russia, China, India, Brazil. This is several billion people. This is not, this is half the planet, population-wise, and so it's really amazing time to be alive, to be writing about it. We feel privileged to be able to do so. There's no shortage of great things to write about, but that's one that we keep a very close eye on.
Yes, you just said it to me so great. And the United States, and I saw that, going back to that Dalal Singh interview on 60 Minutes, and our concept of a worlds-based order, unfortunately, it's become so static in its orientation. And the world just doesn't sit and wait anymore. So things are always, so Xi going to Saudi Arabia, they're not waiting. As soon as the war broke out in Ukraine, Putin wasn't waiting, and the rest, and the Chinese and the Indians and everybody else who were afraid of being caught off are not waiting. And I think one of the great things to come out of this, and nobody really wants to talk about it because they want to talk about NATO, which I believe is an archaic organization anyway and really needs to be restructured for many reasons. Article 5 is a very dangerous in this type of world where we're going to be drawn into war. So when everybody says, well, we want more members, no, you don't. That's more tripwires as far as I'm concerned. But we get caught in this worlds-based orders based on the way that we want to dictate every outcome to the world. And it doesn't work. Sanctions, and it's not just me. I mean, if you go to the Center for Economic Policy Research, which is, I think, one of the far better left-leaning think tanks that there is, they put out pieces twice talking about the ineffectiveness of sanctions, and for many, many, many years. It's not just with this, but that's their first gap, because it's in their mind bloodless, meaning the people in power say, well, we don't have to risk any soldiers, as Biden said in January, that not one American soldier would go into Ukraine, which, why would you reveal that? And then, of course, they wouldn't put it in a no-fly zone. But there are all these things that are far more dynamic. And I think you make a really good point. And we need to watch the way Xi is accepted in Saudi Arabia. And again, it's the dynamicism of that, and to stand there and say, well, and yell about the death of Khashoggi. I don't understand. The world is so fraught with so much pain and suffering on any given day. As Trotsky may have said that if hungry people made war, the world would be in war every day. But that doesn't mean that there aren't significant movements afoot all the time, and there are. And to set your policy on the death of Khashoggi, who was not an American citizen, who was a Saudi citizen. And I might remind everybody, Saudi Arabia is a sovereignty, is a monarchy. As far as I know about a monarchy, the king is sovereign, and what the king says goes. So if the king decides, Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are both autocracy, monarchies, whatever you want to refer to them, they utilize capital punishment, as a weekly show. So I don't know why American policy gets stuck on some of these things. It doesn't make you necessarily a good player, and the world is moving far faster and away from it. And you need to stop hanging on to those things.
Well, great. Yeah, that was awesome insight. And the best way for our listeners to learn about your work, Doomberg, and that's on the Substack?
Yeah, doomberg.substack.com. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Doomberg T as in team. Somebody's squatting on at Doomberg, so don't be confused. And look, guys, it's been a great discussion. Very much enjoyed it. And, looking forward to chatting again.
Great. Thank you. And Ira, your blog you wanted to reference?
Yeah, the notes from underground. I am hopefully going to move to Substack. I'm working on it. You could see through Doomberg, just so, and Adam too. There's a lot of high quality people at Substack. I think they're doing a great job to elevate what journalism fails to do. It's a group here, Doomberg. They're not dependent upon anybody. They don't need access. They don't write for access. I don't write for access. If you write for access, then you're really you handcuff yourself. But anybody who reads Doomberg or even Adam Tooze and others, when you're not writing for access and you're writing to try to distill a modicum of facts and therefore to get to some level of which we strive for, quality investments through really seeking out and not playing to the common narrative, as Ben Hunt would say. I think Doomberg is another place that does a really good job of it. I've really been in awe. I think they really cover the commodity, especially food and energy, as well as anybody.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much, Doomberg and Ira. We'll do it again.
Thanks. It was great. Have a great weekend.
It was great.
Guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really, really enjoyed it.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.